Welcome to today's podcast interview. I've brought on Lezly Kaye. Lezly, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
She's another Aussie guest. I love Aussies, and thank you, Lezly. It's like super early for you, but I'd love for you to share with listeners where do you live and what do you do?
I am from Perth, Western Australia, and I am a somatic business and relationship coach.
What does that mean?
Basically, I help people build businesses, and the relationship part is because our business is actually just an extension of the relationship that we have with ourselves. And so, the more that I did this work, the more that I realized that our internal relationship and the way that we communicate with ourselves, the way that we show up in relationship with ourselves is actually what's playing out in our business.
Yeah.
And then oftentimes that bleeds into our personal relationships. So most of my complaints for high achieving women is that they either don't have a relationship and they've just invested their life in their business, or they have a relationship and it's shit. And so in the work that I do, understanding relationships and how we relate was a clear pathway for me to learn because I wanted to support the women in my world more.
You know what this makes me think of top of mind? Are you familiar with the seven Hermetic Principles?
Yes.
I think it's the third one, but it's correspondence, as within, so without. And so, what you just touched on, I think is so important because what I see come across so much big pain points. Normally, relationships are relationships and money, pretty much. But
Yeah.
LinkedIn is one of my larger platforms. And I literally commented yesterday on somebody's post. There was something about business. And that's exactly what I said that. Your business success is a direct reflection of the relationship you have with yourself. And in other words, if you can't lead yourself, you can't lead others or succeed in business.
Truly, truly. I just literally created a post on this yesterday and I say similar things. It's, when I start working with people, the first thing I look at is their self-relationship. And the first thing I sort of teach on is self-relationship. Everything is a reflection. And you're right, the Hermetic Principle. If you don't have boundaries with yourself, you don't have boundaries with your team. If you don't have boundaries with your team, you start to lose. I mean, powers and control's an illusion, but you start to lose this sense of control over your business because your business starts to dictate to you when you'll show up, what you'll do. And what was true for me and what is true for a lot of women that come into my world is I thought when I was building a business, I was building freedom. And actually, I built a prison based on my own internal dialogue and my own need to be the hero in my client's story. So it took me a lot of time and understanding to undo that narrative inside of my own system and actually start to build a business that fit my values and my life and where I was going, and not the dialogue of what and who the world told me I could or should be.
I think something we could start with is the idea of boundaries. And even
Mm.
for me, I left a 9 to 5 to get into entrepreneurship, which I coined pretty much, it's like a 24/7, 365. I'm always thinking about content and new, like my mind doesn't shut off. And I found myself in habits, and a lot of it I was just in flow, but I could be working till 9 or 10 p.m. because it never shut, there was no 9 to 5. And so now I'm very intentional. I shut it down. Like I don't
Mm.
need to respond to every email as soon as it comes in because that was what I would do. So let's talk about the power of boundaries for self and others. And, how do you create those?
Yeah, cool. I love this. Every time someone comes into my world, whether it's a client or an inquiry, I actually start off with the conversation around boundaries. Like, I don't really have set hours, except if I'm with my son. I'm with my son, and I only have him every second week. And I will say to women that I'm great at communicating boundaries, and you need to be able to receive them. So if I'm
Mhm.
available, I'll respond straight away. But if someone messages me at 7 o'clock at night and I'm about to switch off, I'll generally respond with, I don't have space right now. I'll get back to you when I do. Or I won't respond if I'm not online. And so for me, the key with boundaries, and this is where a lot of people struggle, is actually communicating them and then
Mhm.
standing true in them.
Yeah.
So again, if I have weekends offline, I just communicate to all of my clients like, hey, I'm about to go offline. You can't access me, even in an emergency if you need me. Because people only get annoyed at you asserting boundaries if they feel like their needs aren't being met too. And if you look at it through the lens of attachment styles, if you've got a client that's an anxious attachment style, they want to know that you're always available to them generally. And the safety that you need to create for them in their reality is communication often. They just need to know that they've been considered. Um, yeah, setting boundaries for me is about not caring and caring from a place of like, they don't need to be harsh. It doesn't need to be rude. Boundaries also shouldn't come from anger. That's probably not a boundary, it's a trigger.
Yeah.
Um, Sometimes we think we're setting boundaries, but really we're just avoiding triggers. And so I also say this to people is like boundaries aren't walls, they're guidelines. So boundaries aren't to like wall yourself up and like push out the world and push out any confrontation, because sometimes we avoid confrontation because we don't actually like what is being reflected back to us, which might be a part of ourselves that we're not happy with or proud about. And so sometimes people are like, yeah, I put up a boundary because this person like triggered me. In the beginning, you might need to do that, but my invitation is always, have you put up a boundary for your safety or a boundary to protect your evolution? And
Mm.
it's a really fine line between understanding whether you're self-protecting through a boundary or just avoiding anything that feels uncomfortable. And so, again, I love metaphors, but if we avoid discomfort, we think we're creating an easy life, but really we're suppressing a lot of the parts of ourselves that need to be addressed. And so, discomfort, especially in the business sense, leaning into the places that feel uncomfortable, can actually be the places that afford us the most growth and help us become the version of ourselves that we want to be.
This could not be more timely. Literally today. So, this is what I want to talk about. I think it's a perfect segue to talk about the idea of shadow work and making the unconscious conscious so that we can remove our blocks and create the happiness, freedom, success we seek. But that's exactly what I wrote today. And look, I think we live in a distracted economy. We numb out on social. I actually did a poll on LinkedIn. What is your biggest vice? Food and drinking, shopping, gambling, um, alcohol, or scrolling on social. The number one vice, scrolling on social media. So we're so distracted and numbing out, avoiding ourselves, but you can't outrun you. So
Truly.
let's talk about the power of shadow work and like why it's a need to do that in order to free and liberate yourself.
Yeah, I love this. We operate 80 to 90% in our subconscious mind. We think we're running around out here in control, knowing who we are, knowing how we show up, knowing how we relate in the world, and we don't actually have any idea. Zero. So, shadow work is like the conscious decision to find out the internal dialogue that you have running and look at the parts of yourself you've suppressed or rejected or deemed as unworthy or unlovable or hidden away. And I often say to people, if you want inner peace, like true inner peace, find and love the parts of you that you've deemed the most unlovable. Like if you can find the monster inside of you, and we all think there's a monster of some description inside of us, some monsters that just feel bigger than others. But if we can find that part of ourselves, and the biggest parts often stem from um, suppressed traumas and how we internalize, we both internalize being the victim generally,
Mm.
and then sometimes we can internalize being the monster, depending on what that is. Uh, Hidden desires, like suppressed sexual desires and repression, is a big one. We're often raised in societies where sexuality is deemed as, especially if you're in religion or conservative families, it's like basically our natural primal instinct is deemed to be wrong in some way, unless it's only expressed in a way that feels like you're being a good girl or good boy, basically.
Yeah.
And so when we start to suppress our true nature and sexual desires, that becomes a lot of shadow in a lot of people. And then also, yeah, where we're programmed by society to be good boys and good girls generally, we then start to suppress parts of ourselves or hide parts of ourselves that we deem to be bad in some way. And so this all sort of compresses inside of us and starts to create stories and narratives and behaviors that often come out in triggers or subconsciously in relationships. And, you know, I can't remember who says it, but if you don't make the unconscious conscious, you'll walk through the world like attracting your trauma and calling it fate. It's not the exact quote, but it's something like that. And it's so true.
So Carl Jung says, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate.
Yes, yes, and he is one of the main instigators of shadow work. And so, yeah, it's really just finding out what these unconscious thoughts and patterns and beliefs are and where they originate from. It helps to understand. When I first started on this journey, I didn't have any memories of my childhood. They were so suppressed and repressed inside of my consciousness.
Mm.
And the more I walk this path, the more parts are revealed. Now, you don't have to remember everything. And for those of us, me included, that have big T trauma, I don't want to remember everything. But there is a need to sort of understand the somatic response and the somatic suppression of trauma and where it's stored in our system.
Can we talked about this in the pre-call, so I'm happy to share mine, or if you want to share yours, can we talk about the power and the liberation when we do the shadow work so that you can transform your relationships or your finances, or maybe you can give a client testimony story?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so for me, my biggest suppression or my biggest shadow was I actually subconsciously hated men. Now, I have big T trauma, sexual assault from a very young age, and because of that, my internalized story was that I can't trust men, that masculine men particularly, or big, strong men particularly, were unsafe. And so I then started to disrespect men. I started to secretly fear men, but instead of like being quiet around them in this fear or shutting down in this fear, I flipped it into control. I flipped it into becoming masculine myself. And so the only way in my internal dialogue I was ever going to be safe was if I controlled everyone and I became more powerful than everyone. And so that did kind of drive a lot of my success, but it was it was from my daddy wound and from my wound of men being unsafe, where I then wanted to have power over both men and women, but subconsciously, specifically men. I would do everything in my power to prove to men that I was better than them in some way. I would use my sexuality to manipulate them. Like when I was in corporate, I used to joke to say that if men are dumb enough to think that I'm going to sleep with them, let them. But I would use my sexuality to manipulate men into making business deals. Now, I never slept with them, but it can perpetuate into that. I know so many women that it does. And again, no shadow or shade. It's just a pattern that I witnessed that when we feel inferior internally, we use the tools at our disposal to gain power over people. Now, for women, unfortunately, that can be an internalized use of our sexuality to manipulate to get our needs met, whether in relationship or not in relationship. And so integrating this back into shadow work, sometimes a part of the shadow work we need to do is the forgiveness for ourselves for using ourselves to manipulate circumstances. And when we come to this place of like empathy and forgiveness for ourselves, it's realizing that we just do what we can with the tools that we've got. And we're actually just perpetuating this desire for safety and love.
Mm.
And when we can realize that and identify that not only in ourselves, but in the world around us, we have a lot more compassion and love. But yeah, I controlled my ex-husband for 10 years. I emasculated him for 10 years because in my mind, if I controlled everything, I was safe. But
It's an illusion.
it was such an illusion and it
Yeah.
destroyed my marriage. Like
Yeah.
knowing what I know now, I don't think my marriage would have failed because I have such awareness of I blamed him for everything. And really, I was just perpetuating my own wounds and my own fears and my own insecurities and expecting him to rescue me from that rather than doing the work myself.
Oh my gosh, that's so powerful. I want to deep dive and talk more about relationships. Most of my clients are males, and I have so much compassion for men because men are taught it is weak to express emotions and think about even military mindset that you would be vulnerable and could die. So men suppress, and like I can even see it in my dad, and I can see why my brother has such anger. And because men have done, oh, now I got chills. Men have done nothing but suppress. So, can we talk about what suppression of emotions actually do to us physiologic, uh, physically,
Yeah.
and our nervous system, and where it's blocking us, and how we can, a note I have here is like to live from the truth of who you are. But I think much of us, we're so far removed from our core essence, we don't even know who we are.
Yeah, so true. I actually want to state this by saying men don't express the same way women express. So men and women are two entirely different species in essence. And there is a slight nuance in New Age emotional release where we expect men to express their emotions like women and communicate from their emotions like women. Men aren't women, they
Yeah.
don't. But they do need to express in ways that feel conducive to them. So when I start this conversation, it's often because and not your intention, but for your listeners, I want to sort of pre-frame to say that women are like, yeah, I want my man to express his emotions, and I want basically sometimes we're asking our men to express like women, and that's not conducive because they're not women. Men need men. Men need to find safe places to be able to express their anger, especially men either. So again, shadow work, you either internalize your rage, so you're really emotional and a little bit, I want to say too emotional out here, but then they turn their rage internally to themselves.
Mm.
And so they're self-deprecating, they hate themselves, they call themselves weak, they perpetuate probably a voice of a parent, and
Mm.
they actually can't express their anger into the world. I actually wouldn't trust a man that if I said, "Do you ever get angry?" and they said no, like I don't trust it. I actually don't trust it. So men actually need to have a healthy relationship with their rage, with their anger. It is very, I want to say nuanced and complex, but if we look at traditional gender roles, men are often the providers and the protectors, and women are the nurturers. And it's like men are the drive and direction, and women are the love and the nurturing. And so if you look at that, I want to say physiologically from a man's perspective and a man's natural state, they need to have healthy access to their anger. They need to have healthy access to their frustration because it's one of the emotions they can harness to motivate themselves to create change in their lives and in their world.
Mm.
When they start to internalize that, so let's say there's a man and their dad was abusive to them or their mothers or whatever it might be, so they shut down their anger and they label their anger as bad, they then do suppress that into themselves. And so they might not externally, like I said, externally show it, but they're definitely internalizing that hate in some way or that anger in some way. So like men actually need outlets to like it sounds so dumb, but literally like go chop wood, go punch punching bags, because that is actually a healthy expression for men. It can be for women too, but specifically for men. When it comes to grief and sadness, it is important that we express that, but true emotion only lasts 90 seconds. Everything outside of that is just the story we attach to it. So again, like if you're in touch with your emotions, you can feel it and move through it in a conducive way, which means you're not suppressing it. Now, again, suppression of grief often shows up in anxiety or depression. In severe cases, PTSD, because you have extreme amounts of trauma where it's an extreme pain of like a broken heart. And I'm not an expert on PTSD or war zones, but I can only imagine, given the limited knowledge that I have about nervous system and, well, I have a lot of knowledge about trauma, just not war specific. But if you think about, like the heartbreak of watching someone die in front of you, and you create a brotherhood with the men that you go to war with, like that grief internalized. And what often happens is it feels so overwhelming in the moment. We shut it off and we don't let ourselves feel it. And again, if they allowed themselves to drop into the grief right then and there, they would likely die. They need to suppress it. They need to compartmentalize it. But where it starts to then hurt them and come out sideways is they often don't ever then have access to those emotions because they're afraid that if they turn the tap on, it won't stop.
Mm.
And maybe it is a period of like just being in the grief and feeling everything that's been suppressed. But if it's not healthily integrated back into their lives, that is where anxiety and depression set in, because you don't have the tools and the coping mechanisms and the internal awareness of how to be with your emotions in a healthy way.
Yeah, and then I won't go down this rabbit hole, but I just want to touch on it. Those festering emotions then can lead to the chronic dis-ease and ailments, and stress is the number one cause for, issues in our body. So like we need to, I love the idea, feel it to heal it.
Truly, truly. Like obesity generally, and again, guys, this is very generalized, so please no one come at me. But obesity generally is just the suppression of feelings. And often what we're doing, I was 110 kilos at the height of my $1 million empire because I would just continue to eat food to suppress my emotions.
Well, and what I was sharing with you is I was told this years ago, which turned my judgment into compassion, that a lot of times, especially women who are heavy, had a sexual abuse, and it's actually a protective barrier because they think, well, then I won't be attractive.
Yeah, yeah. And, I've got a lot of trauma in that field, but for me, it was also towards the end of my relationship, there was a subconscious belief that, I was unhappy, but I was too afraid to leave.
Mm.
So what I recognized was part of me was like, well, like I kind of don't want to be attractive to anyone else because I didn't trust myself to not cheat, essentially. In
Uh,
that if this man loves me, there's two things. If this man loves me when I'm unattractive to everyone else, then like maybe I can trust his love because my ex-husband is a beautiful man and loved me more than he loved himself, in fact, but I didn't trust his love because I didn't trust the masculine. And two, because I was unhappy, there was almost this subtle way of sabotaging myself into being like, well, I should be grateful that he loves me because I'm not attractive anymore. And I really attested my weight to being attractive. So yeah, it's so nuanced, weight
yeah.
gain and how we wear our pain, but it's never about the food. If I was to become a weight loss coach, it's never actually about the food. It's never about the patterns and behaviors that we think it is. It's never about just going on a diet. Like people ask how I lost the weight and kept it off. Well, I actually healed the parts of me that wanted to be overweight for protection or self-sabotage or because, because I used my beauty and my sexuality when I was younger. So it was almost like punishing myself. So I stopped using myself in that way. So yeah, it's weight loss is such a complex thing because it's always emotionally attached. It's never actually a lack of control. It's actually a lack of understanding who you are and what pain you're in.
Well, if we bring it full circle and get back to where you started about talking about, our business and personal relationships, I think we're so conditioned to focus on strategy and the external. And I found out the hard way because I spent a lot of money and time and different coaches building a website and getting the right mechanics and all the tech and play. But I was so full of self-doubt, imposter syndrome, and procrastination. I had $0 in my bank account.
Yes.
So again, whether it's money, it's business, it's relationships, it's all an inside job. But let's talk about, because I hear this from clients too, complaining and blaming their partner for all their woes.
Oof. You know, and I don't know if we've said this live or if it was in the pre-talk. Knowing what I know now, I wouldn't have left my ex-husband. There was a lot of blame in our relationship. There was a lot of, from me and probably from him, but I'm going to own my part in this, where I was expecting him to meet me somewhere that I wasn't willing to meet myself. I was getting angry at him for, and even, dipping into this boundary piece, we actually often think that boundaries are assumed within all, like they should know that that's a boundary. Nobody knows shit. Nobody can read your mind. Men's biggest complaint to women is, I can't read your mind. And women's biggest complaint is, he doesn't know me well enough. Men do not understand women, and women do not understand men. And it's actually the fundamental issue with the whole entire world, not just relationships, but that's a whole other can of worms. Women, you know, and okay, so me specifically, in my relationship, I was often expecting my ex-husband to save me from myself. I didn't have a conscious awareness of it, but I wasn't willing to feel my emotions. I wasn't willing to do the deep internal work to actually find out who I was and why I was in so much pain. And there was so much of me that then found this new age polarity teachings, which I study now in more depth. But when I first hit this new age polarity and relating stuff, it was like, well, fuck you. You should lead the relationship and you should be the one to do the work and you should be the one to fix all of these things in our relationship that I've decided are broken. But I'm not going to heal myself. I'm not going to be in a committed relationship with myself before showing up in this marriage. And what I mean by that is, if I was sitting there asking him to do all of these things, but at that point in time, I hadn't actually studied anything or learnt anything. I just read a book and then decided I wanted him to change. I didn't have my own internal relationship. So I wasn't in relationship with my emotions or my desires or my needs, which meant I couldn't communicate my needs to myself, which means I couldn't even communicate my needs to him. So he was kind of disappointing me because I was expecting him to read my mind. And also, I had emasculated him for 10 years. And so he was programmed by me to do as he was told. So when I then started to heal this and started to soften and started to want him to lead and want him to take control, the poor guy was shit scared because I'd punished him for doing that in the past.
Mm.
So he's out of like 10 years of conditioning where I would essentially punish him in subconscious ways. Like I wasn't a nasty person. And by no means, if anyone listening hears this as a part of their story, there's no shame or shadow. Like I don't shame myself for the version of me that I was. I just did what I did with the tools that I had and the awareness that I had. I kind of laugh at myself now because I'm like, fuck, no wonder.
And then hold on. When you know better, it comes down to choosing to do better.
Truly, truly,
Yeah.
truly. But I just pushed away. I was like, nah, fuck you. If you're not going to get on board, like, leave me alone.
Yeah.
We're doing what I know now about, like, men don't communicate like women. And at that point, I expected him to. I expected him to feel his emotions like me, to show his love like me, to pretty much show up like a woman. And I also expected him to read my mind. Now, I have such a good relationship. My ex-husband provides more for me now as my ex-husband than I ever let him provide for me in our relationship.
Mm.
For ages, his head actually spun because he was like, I don't even know who you are. And he didn't actually believe, truthfully, the woman that I am versus the woman that I was. For a very long time, he thought it was a form of manipulation because I was very controlling and I was very dominating and I wasn't very grateful. I never told him I was proud of him, and I was never grateful for the small things he did. Everything he did was never good enough. And so when you don't appreciate someone for the small things over a long period of time, they actually stop wanting to do the big things
Yeah.
because why would they? And so when I actually found, and it's not about faking this, like it's not about manipulating men by telling them you're proud or that you're grateful. for them to believe it, you actually have to feel it to be true. And for you to feel it to be true, you actually have to let go of expectation and stop expecting them to be a fantasy of what you think to be perfect, and give them the space to evolve into what you desire them to be. But that, so women actually lead in relationships. It, as in, men lead as in, I want to say they should steer the ship and have the drive and the direction and sort of be the voice. And women set the tone, because men are purpose-led and women are love-led. So by setting the tone of like loving yourself truly unconditionally, by doing the work on yourself truly to come into such a deep self-relationship where your self-love is unwavering. And what I mean by that is you would actually leave a relationship if it wasn't serving you, not from a place of pain, but from a place of, I know my boundaries, I know my standards, I know my worth. And if I'm not getting met in these, and you can only get met in these if you're truly meeting yourself in them, then we stop creating space for toxic relationships because we stop undervaluing ourselves. But yeah, we set the tone by actually like being the living example of love, and we can inspire our men from this place. We cannot coach or mother them into changing.
Okay, I think this is valuable. A client of mine a few weeks ago noted, now he's very successful in business and relationship has been his biggest pain point. But he noted that he sees on LinkedIn coaches are a dime a dozen, but he's like, Heather, there's all these female life coaches and they're all single. Why? And so his conclusion was these women are doing the internal work, becoming so self-aware that they don't want to relate with an unconscious man. And I can relate to that.
Yeah, I want to say it's actually quite interesting because the world is full of good men. The
Yes.
world is full of good men. I'm also single. So I understand this view, but yeah, I there's a few things that I'm actually in inquiry with right now. Is like, men don't show up in their consciousness the same way that women show up in their consciousness. Men being conscious could just be, and like for me, like the deal breaker is communication. They don't need to be spiritual or into like, from, and again, growth. So they need to be able to communicate and they need to value growth in some way. But growth for me might be, I don't know, studying relating and polarity. Growth for them might be learning how to 10x their business income. They're still in the desire for growth. And it is understanding what the non-negotiables are. Like, I couldn't be with a man that just shut down emotionally and had no emotional intelligence and couldn't actually communicate with me. But
Yeah.
I also used to think that given that I'm, I sit ayahuasca and I hold plant medicine ceremonies and I play in the realm of sexuality and relationships and business. And there was this belief that if a man wasn't exactly in the same fields as me, that I didn't want to be in relationship with him. And actually there was a subtle form of control and ego of like, it needs to look this way for
Yeah.
it to, like a perfectionism actually of like, well, he needs to show up as this perfectly healed, perfectly um aware man. I don't think that that is entirely true. And I think when we start to understand men on a deeper level, we actually start to appreciate their consciousness in a different way. We start to appreciate the ways in which they meet consciousness and emotional intelligence and meet life in attunement with the men's way of doing things rather than the women's way of doing things. And there is such an insidious, like, I want to say programming that we expect men to be more like women and women to be more like men. Like, literally, boss babe era is basically an era of emasculation of men. So when we start to emasculate men by emasculating ourselves, the men often then become more feminine because they need to find their place. They want to find their place. And so there's kind of an inversion,
Yeah.
what I witness, and in my belief system, that there's an inversion in the world. And we've been running this inversion for a very long time, in that our women have become more masculine and our men have become more feminine. And a lot of the work that I do, and especially with business women, is actually correcting that imbalance
Yep.
and helping women become more feminine and helping men become more masculine. And I think my belief, like my purpose, my vision is that when we start to correct this inversion,
Yeah.
we help the world heal. Now, I might be a little crazy or I might have high hopes, but if I can help one woman soften into her femininity through her business, and for me, it's like not about losing power. I think a lot of women, when they hear being feminine and softening, and I'm not trying to take your power away. I'm not, and often for women that are high achieving and successful, they create this power because they want to create safety. And most empires are built on the back of daddy wounds. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just what it is. And so, yeah, my invitation for anyone listening in this conversation is becoming more feminine and having a business isn't about losing control or becoming powerless or submissive or, I had such an aversion to the word submission when I first started this work. And I had such an aversion to thinking that I was going to like give myself to a man. I crave nothing more now. It's chalk and cheese. I crave nothing more than to have a man lead me, nothing more. We have to come at it from a place of being in our power first, though,
Mhm.
and coming into relationship with that internal, I want to say, desire to let love lead us through that relationship.
I think this on its own, we could have had an entire podcast, but I just want to share real quick because I worked in the corporate world for 10 years in very masculine dominated industries. And so I try to match the energy to be heard. And that Miss Independent era, I think, went way, way overboard. So you are 100% right. And until I learned about masculine and feminine energy and the need to flow between, there's a time to quote be masculine in business to have strategy and have goals. But I've been told, and I want to hear from you, that actually being in our feminine essence, our feminine energy is more magnetic and powerful.
Yeah, so feminine power is magnetism. And it is, and we actually pull in through our magnetism. So yes, but the caveat to this, and this is where a lot of teachings get it wrong, is to be in our full feminine expression, we need to feel safe. To feel safe, we need to be held by our own masculine container. So if we're externalizing or internalizing our hate for men and we don't have enough structure or containment or safety, we can't be in our full feminine magnetism. We can't be in our full expression of our feminine force. So the inversion to this is we shut down our feminine, we just operate our businesses in our masculine. I built a $60 million empire in masculine drive and hustle. And in fact, the only femininity that came into it was when I pimped out my sexuality by manipulating men. So I had such inversion on my own truth and the truth of my genetic makeup, my natural way of being. Understandably, because my childhood was so unsafe, I created my own safety and I created my own power. And for me, money was power. Money is actually the expression of love and freedom, but for that period of my life, it was power and control, actually. And so, women in business, especially if you've hustled and done it from your masculine, and what was true for me and what I witness in the women that I serve is almost this fear of coming out of the way that we know how to do business, because we don't know if the business is going to be successful if we stop operating in the ways that we're operating in. But
Mm.
what's happening is we're tired, we're burnt out, we're overworked, we're underappreciated. We basically survive on coffee and we have no like aliveness to us. We're kind of like when we're too in our masculine, we get cold, closed, rigid, and like what I would describe as dry. There's like no love left. We're not emanating the frequency of love. There's no vibrancy left in us because we're not meant to operate that way. We're not meant to build businesses like men. And it's not to reject our masculine traits because we're always both. We just want to lead with our feminine and have our masculine container, which is the structure and the strategy that we need to be successful. And when we can build this safety for ourselves, and this, we actually crave containment as women, but that's a whole nother conversation. When we can build this safety and this containment, which is basically like the container that holds our business, and it might be our non-negotiables, our KPIs, or whatever we want to call it, or the marketing or the team. But once we build that container and we unchain ourselves from what we think business is meant to look like, we actually create freedom for ourselves to soften again. And I attest it to like a lot of business is like sword and shield, and you're on the front line and you're like cutting through the bullshit and you're forging the way, because as women, we want to be good leaders. But if we're doing it from a masculine place, there's no joy in it. There's no pleasure in it. We're just in autopilot doing what we think needs to be done.
Mm.
So I'm often like, if we put down the sword and put down the shield and allowed ourselves to rest back in our business, what does that feel like? And for most women, it's scary as fuck. They feel really exposed and they don't know how to operate. But
Yeah.
unless we can rest back, we've actually built a prison. We haven't built a business. And we've built something that's dependent on us because of an internal need to be a hero or be needed. And so when we start to like realize that this is a relationship, and if we're in our masculine 100% in our business, then we're probably in our masculine 100% in our lives. And it takes practice and desire and understanding to know how to like flip between being the boss at work to then being the wife at home. And this is where polarity can get thrown out,
Yeah.
because like I want to say I'm a very feminine woman, but I'm quite masculine in my business because I know what needs to get done and I'm not afraid to get shit done. But when I'm in relationship with men, and I'm not in a relationship, but it's more like even in conversation with men, I literally consciously move myself out of this, I'm not controlling anyone, but I'm holding safety for them. I'm creating containment for my clients. I'm in my direction and my and a little bit of nurturing. There's some mother in the way that I hold space, but I'm holding the container for people. So I have to consciously, when I'm then relating even with my friends and my guy friends, I actually have to consciously like get out of my directiveness and drop back into my receptive nature. And I have practices for that. It's often breath work where I actually just consciously come back into to slowness and contact with my body and sensation again.
I think we could literally talk for hours, and I would. I want to bring it back to, if we get back to that idea of correspondence, the Hermetic principle, and really like I'm seeing all the Hermeticism play in this. And if nobody knows what I'm talking about, I've done videos on that, but you can Google the 7 Hermetic principles to really understand these different things. But back to correspondence. When we make the unconscious conscious, so I'd love to hear how you walk clients through it, but wherever somebody's feeling stuck or not making progress, is there something that you're walking them through to help make the unconscious conscious?
Yeah, oftentimes burnout and overwhelm is actually an inner child relationship. So I do a
Mm.
lot of parts work. So what I call long form burnout, which I find in some women, tends to be one because we've been in our masculine and we're in overwork, but it tends to also be a tantrum from our inner child. If you've never done inner child work and you're just listening to this and you're like, what is she talking about? Basically, the whole world is stuck at the age of 4 until they actually start to do the internal work.
Mm.
And so, a lot of times when I speak to women, it's like you think that it's your woman running your life, it's your 4-year-old girl. And so for me, the first process I go into is actually reconnecting with the inner child, because overwhelm or freeze response, or being stuck, is actually a form of freeze response, which is generally there's one part of you, the mature part of you, that's like, cool, I have this plan. We're going this way. We're going to do the thing and build the business. And if you've never done any internal work, and specifically inner child work, there's probably a little 4-year-old inside of you that is actually running your nervous system and your subconscious. And she's saying, fuck you, mum, because you are the mum in this relationship. I'm not doing anything. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not leaving my room. And we're not actually going to go do these things that you want to do because I don't think that you love or appreciate me. And so the woman in us is like, why am I stuck? Why am I not moving? Why do I have these 10 things to do and I'm not actually doing them and I'm laying around on my phone and I'm, watching movies or Netflix? What's happening is this part, the inner child, is literally in a tantrum. And until we can address those parts of us, and I do a lot of hypnotherapy and somatic parts work. And until we can address those parts of us and literally start to not only acknowledge the inner child, but also reparent the inner child, we stay in freeze response or overwhelm or burnout. And so what I've like dubbed as like long form burnout, which is basically having no motivation to do anything, is not actually burnout. It is actually, there's a part of you that inside of you screaming for your love and attention that you've likely ignored for your whole entire life. And it's just gotten to a point where your nervous system is in a freeze response because if you think of a car and a brake, it's like one foot's on the accelerator and one foot's on the brake.
Yep.
And so it's like burning the wires of the brake. And so you're constantly like in this tension point of like push pull inside of your system. And it's exhausting to fight yourself. Now, you don't know that you're fighting yourself oftentimes, but the exhaustion actually comes from the avoidance of this inner dialogue and the avoidance of the shit that you've shoved down for so long. So for me, burnout's the first sign that you actually have unaddressed trauma. Like if you're sitting here going, I'm constantly burnt out, and for me, I would do like cycles. I would work for 3 months and then I would have like 2 weeks off and I'd pretty much just sleep for 2 weeks. Like my holidays were never holidays. It was just burnout recovery. And most people run in this cycle.
Yeah.
So if you're in constant states of burnout, like it is because you're avoiding something. There is some internal relationship that you're not spending the time to be in relationship with, and you think that you can outwork it, out train it, out eat it, out something it, and you can't. You can't, I promise. It will come out sideways.
I'm curious to know, kind of like how you phrase it, but for me, what this is talking about, like this is a process and this is doing the inner work, and it's actually how you free and liberate yourself. But since much of society is stuck in this unconscious survival mode, can we talk about what's on the other side?
Yeah, truly inner peace, liberation. I wrote an article in conjunction with YPO about a year ago now, actually, um, talking about this elusive inner peace that people ask about. And, I built a multi-million-dollar business thinking that all of this money was going to buy me the happiness that I was chasing.
No.
I was like, "Ooh, I'm unhappy. So maybe if I make more money, I'll become happy." Money only amplifies what's already internally there. So if you build a business or an empire, as I did, from a place of lack and unworthiness, you find more lack and unworthiness. You just have more time to sit in that shit. And the reason that most people keep building empires is a form of avoidance. So I would work 12-hour days, 6 or 7 days a week, not actually consciously. I thought it's because I wanted to make more money. Subconsciously, it's because I was avoiding this mean girl inside of my head, this constant nagging of you're a piece of shit, you're evil. If people knew who you were, they wouldn't love you or like you. In fact, one of the reasons I started to do the work was I was making like 60K cash paydays in my bank, and I would receive the money and I started to track, like I would be happy for like this long
Yeah.
or grateful for like this long. And I was like, why can't I hold my happiness? Why can't I hold my joy? I wasn't actually trying to find my pain when I first started, but then I realized that pleasure and pain, or happiness and sadness, are the opposite sides of the same coin. Because I was throwing out my pain and avoiding my hurt, I was also throwing out my pleasure and my joy and my happiness.
Mm.
Yeah, so there was just this mm, disillusion with what I thought life was. And I was chasing happiness, but what I got was numbness and coldness and shutdown. And what this work has given me, it's funny when I first started this journey, and this is why I support women to deepen their self relationship, is I did have a fear that I was going to not be want to be successful again. And there actually was a period where I did not want to be successful. Like I burnt my business to the ground because once I sort of realized what I'd built my life on, I rejected my life.
Mm.
And so I guide women that have sort of hit the pinnacle of success to maintain their wealth and their life whilst we recreate their internal landscape. And I talk about like infrastructuring our leadership and infrastructuring our lives so we don't have to burn it all to the ground. Because again, knowing what I know now, that's not necessary. And it's why all of my programs are called Grace, because I lacked grace in this version of me. I just wanted to burn everything down. But life is interesting. Like I'm probably more ambitious or more driven than I was before, but it comes from a place of being in service to something greater than myself. So I'm truly devoted to the world stop perpetuating this pain. Like I'm so sick of women blaming men and men blaming women. And when we can take back control, actually the illusion of control, when we can take back this control and this continual perpetuation of pain and actually start to do the work, it's like it's not that we stop feeling pain and upset, but we don't let the stories run. Like I said, true emotion lasts 90 seconds. I can feel emotion now. Like I'm so in touch with my nervous system and my body and my inner landscape that I get like a tightness at like it's only subtle that sits across the top of my chest. That I'll be moving through the world and I've instilled a habit that every time I get in my car, I do 3 deep breaths because we often breathe into our chest and not into our belly. So we're subconsciously breathing all of the time. And when we can make our breath conscious, we also make our subconscious thoughts more conscious.
Mm.
And so I've programmed myself that every time I get into my car, because I get into my car on most days, I consciously take 3 breaths. And it actually helps me get back into touch with what I'm feeling in the moment and I don't suppress it.
Mm.
So I could be sitting here right now, and in fact, as I've done that, I can feel a little heaviness here. So I know that there's some sadness based on something that's happened in the last couple of days. And rather than let that fester and let that store inside of me and let that build stories and so what happens is, let's say, you know, and this is true, let's say we're dating and then that dating comes to an end. And especially if you're self-aware, you're like, cool, I've dealt with it, it's fine. There can be subtle layers of grief or sadness or disappointment that we suppress because we've made it mean something about ourselves. We've attached a story to it. Like, I'm not good enough, or I'm not wanted, or whatever our core wound is, we'll start to attach a story to the emotion. The liberation comes from, as soon as I get off this call with you, now that I've identified that, I will go cry. I won't shame it. I don't need to attach story to it. I just have a relationship with my emotions where I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. I didn't notice that that was there because I've been so full. I don't use the word busy, I use the word full. I'm in launch of new programs and new techniques for the women in my world. So I've been really full that I hadn't even noticed. And I'm quite a conscious person. And I still hadn't even noticed that there was an underlying emotion here wanting to be expressed. So that's what's on the other side. It's like I no longer try to pretend I'm something or someone I'm not. I no longer try and hide my emotion. I show up in my full authenticity in every aspect of my life. And then my energy is not wasted on wearing masks or pretending to be someone I'm not. I can actually use my energy to, if I want to go lay in the sun, which I do most days for 2 hours, I'm not actually wasting my time because I have the space in my life to create the life that I want, not the life that everyone told me I should have. And emotional alchemy brings that level of freedom.
What I want to note here, and it's a realization I've had recently, is like there's no finish line. Understand, like when you become self-aware, there's just layers and layers to dissolve and uncover. And But I think rather than being overwhelmed and it feel daunting, I try to live from a state of curiosity. And it's like, what's my next step? What's my next level? Where's the next growth and evolution? And even I have talked myself out of relationships. I'm not ready yet. Well, now I realize there's never, like, I want to be with that partner that we're growing and evolving together. So, and
Really.
I mean, we could talk about, oh my gosh, for days. I love this. So, here's what I want to ask you. I would love to know what are some of your daily rituals that helps you stay conscious and aware and intentional?
Like I just mentioned, I have an anchor. So if I get too full, every time I'm in my car, I take 3 breaths into my belly. And breath work is, I'm a breath work practitioner. Breath work is one of my most used tools to come into more deeper relationship with our body. So breath work actually opens the gateways between our nervous system and our limbic brain and our um, prefrontal cortex. So our ego, our consciousness, and our subconscious. It is actually the gateway to getting into our subconscious mind.
Mm.
Now, if you do long form deep breath work, you can have breakthroughs in accessing emotion and releasing traumas. I like to use it as a tool, like I just did then, even just those 3 breaths consciously, I could feel emotion in the top of my chest. And so I will most days, and you can tell that I haven't for the past couple of days based on that, or I can, is like just close my eyes in the morning and like breathe into my body and ask myself what's here for me to feel.
Mm.
I'll literally just close my like what's here. And then I have a good somatic relationship. So I can feel tightness in my chest. I can feel some tightness in my neck. And then I'll keep breathing into the tightness in my chest and the tightness in my neck. And I'll ask it what's here, like what's here for me to know, what's here for me to feel. And I'll just keep breathing into this place. So after this call, I will literally go put on some music. For me, music helps me break through my consciousness and get into a bit of a trance state. So I'll go put on some music and I'll just breathe into this constriction I can feel in my chest.
Yeah.
And I'll just breathe there and I'll let the emotion run. And again, like some days I do morning practices, which goes for an hour or 2 hours. Some days my practice is 20 minutes. And for me, it's just being in the relationship with myself, creating the space to actually go. And again, it's an inner child relationship for me. It's like, baby girl, you're important to me. I love you. And I'm creating space for you to be seen and heard right now. Sometimes she wants to throw a full tantrum. And truthfully, I do let her. Rage rituals are a whole vibe. But some days she wants to throw a tantrum. Some days she just wants to move a little slower. Some days she just wants to feel loved a little more. And so for me, I'm like my practice, whatever it is, whether it's breath work, sometimes I do dance, sometimes I do somatic shaking, sometimes I just meditate, sometimes I listen to Joe Dispenza. I love a good Joe Dispenza meditation. I'm not rigid in what I do, but for me, it's the relationship with making space for my self relationship. Like, even if I just lay there and listen to music for 20 minutes, it's the intention of this time is for me and this time is to be in deeper relationship with myself. Now, it's not to lay there scrolling on social media. It's not to put on music that makes you numb out. I also just want to state from a master hypnotherapist, and I know how programmable we are, the music you listen to matters because every word that you listen to is actually programming your mind.
Yep.
God, I used to be a full like rap and R&B, but the subliminal messaging, and it might sound a bit conspiracy theorist to you, but when you actually understand the science behind it and you understand, like hypnotherapy for me, yeah, it's a great modality that I use, but all it showed me was that in every moment we're either programming ourselves for good or programming ourselves for worse.
Yep.
Fortunately, with a lot of music, and whether it's intentional or unintentional, there's a lot of subliminal messages. Like if you're listening to rap and all they're talking about is like drugs and sex and alcohol, it's kind of going to program you to have that viewpoint of the world.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't mean you have to go out and listen to gospel, but just be really, I mean, sometimes I do, but just be really intentional with what you're listening to, especially in these moments. So like find music, like I have like a love song mix and I have actually a mix that actually makes me feel heartbroken. And I use that to access, if I feel like I'm stuck in an expression, I will play music that lets me access those parts of myself. And so, yeah, it's less about, you know, sometimes I pray, sometimes it's gratitude. Like I'm just not rigid. But for me, it's like, what relationship am I building? What what am I desiring out of this on the other side? And you could just journal for 30 minutes. It doesn't need to be
Yeah.
so controlled. It just needs to be a relationship that you build.
I think the point is, and there are countless modalities, but play around and experiment and figure out what works for you. Because if we go back to the very beginning, the relationship you have with yourself reflects in every relationship and business in every part of your life. So if
Really.
your life is falling apart, what go within.
Always. Even if you're successful, but you feel a sense of emptiness, go within. And that
Yeah.
was my journey. Like if you feel this sense of emptiness, like I never feel empty anymore. There's not a gaping hole inside of me that I'm trying to fill with something or find something else to make me feel worthy or whole or complete. Again, it's a forever journey. There'll be more parts that I find. Touching on your forever journey, I say to people when they start with me, this journey is not for everyone. And I think there is a disillusion that we're going to get to this place of inner peace and then that's it. But you kind of just get better at weathering everything inside of you. So your external world is more the flavor of life that you want to live rather than continuing to perpetuate this internal story.
I want to ask you this because we've touched on a lot. What do you believe is a key takeaway you want listeners to get?
Mm. The illusion of control, like most people are trying to assert some form of control over their life, whether it's through controlling their partners, controlling their business. The kind of universal joke is the only control you have is over yourself. In a sense, it's not entirely true, but let's just roll with the only control you have is over yourself. And so if you're feeling like you're noticing that you need to control everything, start by being in such deep relationship with the reasons why you want to control. Like actually start to ask yourself the question, what am I gaining from this? And then just follow that thread. Like for me, healing or becoming conscious is like you see a little thread and you start to pull it and it starts to unravel, and you'll eventually get to the cause of these belief systems. And when we find where that thread comes from, that's when we can start to do lasting change in our lives.
Here's what I'd love to do to wrap up the interview. Not that I want it to end, but what is a quote or motto that you live by?
Oh, you are not defined by your circumstances, you're defined by your choices.
What is a book you're currently reading or highly recommend in this space?
Hmm. Playing with Fire by Justin Pierce and London Winters.
What's that about?
It's actually a polarity book, but I actually recommend it to all of my business clients because when you start to understand your own internal polarity, so your own masculine and feminine dynamics, you actually understand more how you relate and show up in the world.
Final question. What advice would you give your younger self?
Woo! Um, love yourself, like truly, deeply spend the time to love yourself and stop trying to find that love in people, places, things.
Yes, such a great note to end on. Lezly, thank you so much for today's conversation.
You're welcome, my pleasure.